Well, it's that time of the year again. End of unit tests, chapter exams, and finals. So what does it take for your child to ace these exams that are coming up? You know, it's not just the time they put in, but it's the way in which they study that makes the biggest difference. You know, I found that when kids generally do okay during the school year and have a hard time on these big cumulative exams, it's because they're falling into one of three camps. They kind of like have their own study personalities, if you will. First, let's start with the group I call the crammers. These are the kids that tend to study the night before. They don't always plan ahead and don't have a terrific sense of urgency. It almost is like something has to be right up against a deadline for them to get going. Then we have the memorizers. These are the kids that actually do really well on tests that ask them about facts and figures, but they have a harder time connecting the dots. For example, in history, they may learn about two battles, but they have a hard time understanding how they're related and how they're connected. In math, they usually do well learning skills in isolation, but when they have to apply that skill in a different context, it's often hard for them. And then lastly, we have kids, I call them the absorbers. These are the kids that school has generally come easy to. In elementary school, they never really had to study, pretty much the same with middle school. But as they get older and they need study skills, which they've never had to use in the past, things are harder for them. It's more complicated. And because they've never had to practice using study skills, they don't have them to pull out of their back pocket. So what do if you have one of these three kids? You know, let's start with the crammer. First of all, the crammer can benefit from this idea called distributed practice. It's actually based in research, and studies show that when kids take, say, an hour that they would have spent on Thursday night preparing for a Friday exam, and they distribute it over a few days, say they plan on studying 20 minutes Tuesday, 20 Wednesday, and 20 minutes on Thursday, they will get a better grade on that Friday test. Now, I often ask people, well, why is that? And often kids and adults will say, well, that's just because they reviewed it more. And that's actually not what it is. It's really sleep. You know, when you sleep, when you learn something and then you sleep on it, you're consolidating that information into long-term memory. And if you do this over a period of time, over a few days, you're more likely to have it not just the next day, but even 2 weeks later or a month later. You want that information you're learning going into long-term memory. But when you cram, it's just going into short-term memory. So you might do okay on the quiz the next day, but you're probably not going to remember it later on when you really need to know it. All right, next, we have the memorizers. Again, these kids are great at memorizing facts, but connecting the details is harder for them. These students often benefit from learning in groups, and that's because when they hear something discussed from others' points of view, and they learn how other kids are connecting the dots and making broader conclusions, it really helps them to do the same. I found that because the skill doesn't come easily to these students, they often need direct instruction on how to think more critically. So sometimes a tutor is helpful as well. And then lastly, we have the kids that are the absorbers, and they need skills that they're going to see an immediate impact from. Because they're really bright and because things have come easy to them in the past, they benefit from high payoff activities. And one of them is usually using the study guide effectively. You know, there's a lot of research that shows that when kids reread information, they read through their chapter notes or they read through the book, it's actually not a great way to study. But in fact, if you study using a study guide, you're far more likely to ace that exam. So what is that like? Well, for younger kids in elementary school and even middle school, teachers often hand out study guides, and they're kind of like these fill-in-the-blank worksheets. And research shows that if you make 3 copies of those study guides and you fill them in from memory as best you can, and then when you're completely out of ideas, you can look back at the information, and you go through that process 3 times, you're much more likely to do well on the final. The reason is you're not just reading something through, but you're also writing it out. And that tactile or that kinesthetic modality is really helpful to learning. So I hope those ideas are helpful for your crammer, your absorber, and your memorizer.